get out of a bachelor's degree. Some people are like, yeah, I figured out what I want to do. I'm going to, be a dentist now. That didn't happen for me. So I took 2 years off. I went to Guatemala. And I got closer to the issues that I had up to then only read about. And I thought, I'm not really content now with just reading about these things and trying to make eloquent arguments about them in paper form. It's important to actually get a sense of experience it.
Kyle is actually one of my oldest friends, and he also happens to be one of the best drummers that I've ever seen or had the pleasure of playing music with, but we don't really talk about that. Kyle just got back from South Sudan, where he was working with the Danish Refugee Council, meeting with a variety of people in an effort to better understand the political unrest and the civil war that is currently plaguing the country. Believe it or not, Kyle was one of the people that initially inspired me to start this podcast in the first place. Hearing him talk about his experiences all over the world and getting to experience so many different ways of life really got me excited on exploring his unique lifestyle and how he has learned from the things he's been able to see firsthand. In this episode, we talk about some of the things we have in common, like being freelancers and how it is similar no matter what industry you're in. We obviously talk about travel and the importance of not being closed-minded when visiting new places, and being aware of your circumstances. This will be the last episode of 2018. I hope that you've enjoyed the show so far. I'm looking forward to talking with more great people in 2019. Happy holidays and Happy New Year, everyone. Let's kick 2019's ass. So today on the show we have longtime friend, old friend, Kyle Jacques.
Longtime listener, first time caller. Happy to be here.
Well, I'm very happy to have you. You've had a lot of interesting things happening very recently. Interestingly,
my car broke down.
Yeah. You went Christmas shopping today. That's a big
Christmas
one.
Shopping.
Almost got lost. So actually, funny enough, last week I was at the Eaton Center and I totally got lost in the bay.
Yeah.
It happens.
That's how they design it. Well, the bay at the Eaton Center is 11 stories, and there's just that one escalator in the middle.
And that's the thing. I got off the escalator one stop too late.
Yeah.
And I was totally disoriented.
Actually, the last time I went to the bay, I went up to one of the staff and I said, "Can you tell me how to get outside?" And she was like, "I actually don't know." She was lost.
She doesn't know where she is.
And I was like, "Oh my God, how long is your shift?"
Yeah. I just got here.
Yeah.
So I may as well just say this. Kyle and I recorded this podcast 2 months ago now. When Kyle was on the brink of doing a bunch of interesting things. And I was listening to it, I was editing it, and I messaged Kyle saying,
You were boring back then.
I did. Yeah. You were boring. We have to do this again.
Let's do this one more time.
Yeah. Well, I was listening to it and I was just kind of I had this realization, why am I going to release this when Kyle literally just got back and had all these really interesting things happen? In the last one, we just talked about them and now you've actually done them. So let's just
last time it was more me speculating.
I may die.
I think I'll survive, but yeah.
And what Kyle means by that is he actually just returned from South Sudan.
Yeah.
The South Sudan.
No, not the. That's colonial shit.
Oh. Before we move any further,
Well, let's give a little background.
Yeah, let's give a little background.
Maybe we can talk about how we did meet.
Okay.
Because I've known you for a very long time. We met through mutual friend.
Yes.
The first time I met you, I was in grade 8.
Yeah.
I think. You always remind me that I was wearing a baggy, faded Led Zeppelin t-shirt.
Yeah, blue jeans.
With baggy blue jeans and scuffed New Balance sneakers. Before New Balance sneakers kind of came back. They were still very, very uncool.
That and before the Led Zeppelin shirts came back too.
Yeah, right. So yeah, we met and you found out through some grapevine that I played the drums.
Well, yeah. I recorded this really, 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 really bad acoustic bad album.
Oh yeah, and the picture and the album cover, it was like a 4-song EP.
Yeah.
And the album cover, sorry to laugh in your face, was you like sitting on the dock of your cottage, you know, like staring off longingly into the sunset.
Okay, this is embarrassing. Do you remember what the name of that album was called?
I'm a big dumb idiot.
Fly With Me.
Yeah. Oh yeah, I do remember that. Yeah.
Anyways,
I don't know. I can't believe it didn't take off. If Spotify was around then, you would have blown up and toured with John Mayer. It was just the timing was bad for you.
Probably. But anyways, you laugh now, but you heard the album and you're like, yeah, I'll start a band with this guy.
Yeah. So I guess I'm also at fault.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I was just like, I was at the point in my life where I was excited to transition from listening to Led Zeppelin in my room to actually playing music in real life with people.
Yeah.
So I was so keen on doing that I decided to look past the crap that you put on that CD. Start a band with
the
you.
faults that I had.
Yeah. And then, so yeah, we played in the band for a while, and then you found out I was I never came to band practice because I joined a new band, and then that band broke up.
Yeah.
Something like that.
That is the expedited version of it. Yes.
Yeah.
You joined a better band, pretty much a band that had way more potential. And in that you ended up doing a few small tours out to the East Coast, and
just one in the East Coast, but a few smaller tour things elsewhere.
Well, you lived the short dream of any band, but like, did you ever, because you were and are still very into music. Was music ever the goal, like the end career that you wanted to be?
100%. Yeah. When I was 5, my parents had, there's like a 8-part Beatles documentary called The Beatles Anthology, and they had it all on VHS. And they threw it on one day, and I saw Ringo Starr, and I was like, that's it. You know, that's what I want to do.
Yeah.
That was easy. You know, I thought I'd have to worry my whole life about what I want to do.
You were thinking about this crap when you were 5?
Yeah. No, not what I want to do with the rest of my life. It was very immediate then. It was like, he looks cool, and I want to also
look cool.
So when you're 5, so then I made my parents buy me a drum kit, and for like a pretty long time, the dream was be in a famous band, go on tour. Yeah, that's all I wanted. And then, as you say, I mean, we didn't. I'd hesitate to say that I got to fully experience that lifestyle. Mm-hmm. I mean, we did do a couple shorter tours, but I got to learn that even though I really liked playing the drums, which I still do, and I still play in bands, that wasn't quite the thing I wanted to do all the time. Mm-hmm. I do think that playing in a band and going on tour, some of the bands that we know and are friends with, right, they spend 100 to 200 days of the year on tour, yeah. Right, sleeping on a bus.
If they're lucky, a bus.
Yeah. It could be a Astro van like Mike Wickens had, or the van that we had. And I think that lifestyle really suits some people. Mm-hmm. And you meet people when you're in bands like this that say, this is it for me. I like this. I don't want to sit in an office. I want to be seeing the world and playing music every night. And that was kind of me, but not totally me. And yeah, I think after once I had gone to university, I thought, well, this is a lifestyle I'd like to keep part of, but mm-hmm. that I wouldn't want to sign up to full time. If it influences my life now, I mean, yeah, because I even think of where I just was. I mean, if you work in a humanitarian organization, if you're working in some of these countries where this work is happening, things can be pretty all over the place and pretty hectic, and you can find yourself sleeping in some pretty uncomfortable places. Yeah. you're not really adhering all the time to a 9-to-5 lifestyle. You're expected to just, be prepared for anything to happen.
Yeah.
And spending some time driving around in the van does kind of help you. There were times in South Sudan where I was like, oh, this is fun. It's like being on tour again,
Yeah.
So
there's guns and bullets and
thankfully there weren't when I was there.
Yeah.
But there were, they just weren't near
Around
enough to
you.
me that I could see and hear them.
Well, it's something that I want to transition into because when I was in a band, and I didn't realize this until much later in life, but being in a band in a very small scale is like owning a business and running a business. It's a little bit entrepreneurial, and freelance. That's my hard transition into. You are technically a freelancer right now, are you not?
Yeah.
So
I suppose you could say that.
Yeah, in which I am also, and so I find that. But what's interesting and what I'm curious about learning more about is what the world of freelance is like in your line of work versus what it is,
right?
What I'm used to or what I know of it to be. And like when you first got into this line of work, did you know that like, oh, I'm going to be a freelancer in this industry, or were you after something different?
I think. So I suppose what you mean by being a freelancer is that in this broad category of international politics or international affairs or whatever, it usually doesn't shake out that you get a position with an organization and then you stay there for the rest of your life.
Right.
That does sometimes happen. There are people that will go and work for the Canadian government and spend the rest of their life there working for the Global Affairs Department. But there are other sectors, the humanitarian sector, United Nations, different agencies of the United Nations where they don't do that. They sort of say, well, we'll give you a 6-month contract and then we're going to promise you nothing after that. So it does feel a little bit freelancy in that sense. So this assignment with the Danish Refugee Council was a 3-week super short-term contract. And many people make a living working short-term contracts like this, usually longer than 3 weeks. It'd be a couple months here, a couple months there. I did not think that was what I was going to be getting into. Like most people, I think sort of naively, I thought, oh, I'm going to just hand my resume into the UN and they're going to hire me for the rest of my life.
Well, why wouldn't they? Yeah.
But that doesn't happen. Wasn't expecting it, but we've talked about this with each other before. I think there are pros and cons of that sort of lifestyle. The way I think about it is you're sort of making this trade-off between security. It's like security versus flexibility, The great thing about working for something like the government, if you get a full-time job there, is you feel very secure in where you are, and that's nice. And then you can put roots down and you can make a nice home like you've made here. But for many, that's also the kind of grounds people too much into where they are. Whereas if you're a freelancer, you have a little bit more movement.
Sure.
Right? You can say, well, maybe I'll do this, like you say, well, I'm going to go do this project for a couple of weeks, but then I'm going to have a week or two where I can go to Iceland with Lindsay or wherever the hell you guys went last time, But then you have these moments where the security isn't there.
Yes.
Where you say, shit, I haven't had work in a while and I'm getting a little nervous. And Lindsay's tapping her foot like, what are you doing during the day, And there's a bunch of different factors that go into that. In many ways, it's a privilege to be able to get into this, as you call it, sort of freelancing. Some people have much more flexibility to take the risks in that sort of lifestyle. We were just talking the other day. Both of us spent a lot of time living with our parents.
Yeah,
after we graduated, because we were like broke as fuck. And
Well, that's the thing. Yeah, that's something I forgot to mention. The freelance thing. When you're not working, and when you're starting,
like really not working.
And that's the thing. When you're starting out and you're trying to start out, you're trying to break into whatever industry you may be going into. It is tough, and that's why we both lived with our parents to kind of get
which is totally a risk some people can't take. You know, some people say, well, it's not so easy for me to move in with my parents, or I have to start paying bills, and I need the security, even if I don't really want it. You know, I need it.
Well, you mentioned that like people go to school in Toronto, and then all of a sudden they are in Toronto trying to get up and running in Toronto, and they have to pay Toronto rent,
which is just something I would never wish on anybody. You know, it's a horrible experience when you first start looking at what apartments in Toronto cost.
And those are the things that sidetrack people. Ultimately, I think because because if you can't float yourself or whatever, you have to get a job at Burger King, and you're not chasing down the things that you want to be chasing down. So
I think it just depends on the type of person,
exactly
the type of person you are, but also the situation you're in and that you found yourself in,
and the goals you have, right? And not everybody has goals that aspire to going in that, like ending up in that realm, right? So.
And you can see that. I'm sure you see this too sometimes when you explain what you do to people, and they're just like, I don't get it. You know, I don't get why you're doing what you're doing. I don't know why you wouldn't want to just show up at the same place every day.
Honestly, I've been doing this for 10 years, and up until recently, that was the case. Now that I actually I've been lucky enough to have a commercial that is in heavy rotation on the majority of large networks.
The Zamboni thing.
Yeah, for
that was
Casper.
Great. I didn't realize that was your voice on it.
Yeah, it was my voice, yeah.
That came on. We were getting chicken wings at Hurricanes.
Oh, really?
On Bloor, and then that commercial came on. And I was like, what is that nasally, annoying voice on this commercial? And then I realized it was you.
Yeah, that was me. It's my very first cameo.
Yeah, it was really good.
But like now when people ask like, what do you do? And I tell them and they look weird, I say, watch this. And then they all of a sudden get it. It makes sense. I make ads for companies.
Well, there's definitely this, this happens with musicians as well. If you're at a party and you're going around the circle, what do you do? And someone says, well, I'm a chartered accountant. And then one person says, well, I'm in insurance. And then one person says, well, I'm a musician. Everyone's kind of like, you know, you're a musician? Like,
yeah.
But then it changes when you say, I'm a musician and I go on tour. Suddenly people are very interested in you. You know, you've gone from someone who people think is lying to someone that lives like a sort of, that is like, oh, wow, like I've never actually met a touring musician.
Yeah. Well, it's because everybody and their dog is a musician now.
Yeah.
Just like everybody and their dog is a photographer or a filmmaker or whatever.
Right. And I'm sure you get this, right? You say, oh, I'm 100%. A photographer. And you're like, oh yeah, so is my 13-year-old daughter with her iPhone.
Yeah, exactly.
But then you say, no, actually, like my commercial played in Hurricanes down the road and
and everybody saw it.
Yeah. And every drunk person in Hurricanes saw it. Like
yeah, exactly. And they knew it was me. Yeah.
Yeah. But then some people don't make it in the industry. Their band doesn't take off, their photography career doesn't take off, and they do something else. So it's effort, but it's also luck.
Yeah.
It's a whole bunch of things.
There's no real recipe for it. You just, everybody's kind of finding their way in it, I guess. I don't really know. I look back at how I got to where I am, and I'm nowhere close to where I want to be. But I can't attribute any one circumstance, any one thing to like on the map of like how I got to where. There's actually this meme that shows up on my social channels every once in a while, and there's like one picture that says this is what people think success looks like, and it's like a straight line, and then something beside it says this is what success actually looks like, and it's just a giant squiggly line and tangles of whatever. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. You just are just getting bounced around and trying to navigate it just like anybody else, and some people come out on top, some people don't.
Yeah, and I think it would be very easy to look at someone like you who's become relatively successful in the industry.
Definitely not.
I said relatively.
Relatively. For like the bottom tier, maybe. I'm starting a podcast for a reason.
But I mean, like if there was a, 18-year-old kid who had his
sure,
whatever camera, and was like, oh, I really want to get into film, I'd say you should talk to my friend Jesse. He's making a pretty good go at it. And they might look to you as like, wow, like you're ultra successful and blah, blah, blah. But then if they, you know, sat down like this with you and talked to you for more than an hour, you'd just be like, well, I fucked this up. I fucked this up. Like, I thought I was going nowhere this time.
Yeah.
You know?
You haven't, like, the last 2 years of my
rent
life.
this month.
Yeah.
Like,
you haven't seen my bank account.
yeah.
Yeah.
Which is, you know,
Well, and that's the thing. Like,
no one's interested in someone who's always successful.
No. And that's the thing. I try to, while I have been lucky, I have been able to do some pretty cool things. I try to be real about it and as open and come across as humble as I can in saying that, yeah, this project was sweet and I'm glad it's getting a lot of great press, but like there were 2 or 3 years there where I was laying on the couch over here and
I saw you.
Yeah. And didn't
lying
know
on
what
that
I was
couch. It was,
yeah.
I just felt terrible for
you.
you.
It was a sad time. And you just don't know what you're doing. You're questioning everything. And that's just life. And everybody goes through that stuff.
Yeah. It's a little bit of that is healthy.
I think so.
Kind of keeps you moving.
Yeah. You had a paper published very recently.
Yeah.
Which is exciting stuff.
I thought it was exciting. I mean, no one's going to read it.
I read the title when you sent it to me.
Yeah.
And I couldn't pronounce a few words. And I was like, oh, this isn't going to go well.
Spanish will do that to you.
Yeah.
I mean, it was an academic paper.
Okay.
And so it's for a certain audience. It's for an academic audience. But it is an accomplishment if you're in the academic world. So I mentioned I had been in Ecuador last year. I was with a research team that was studying a initiative by the Ecuadorian government to to do many things. One was to reduce their extraction of oil. Ecuador is a OPEC country that produces and exports a ton of oil. But also Ecuador had discovered a lot of oil underneath the Amazon rainforest, and the government was experimenting with different ways to try and protect the Amazon rainforest, but also to try and move itself away from just extracting too much oil. So that's what the paper's about. But yeah, I mean, it was, I mean, I think it relates to what we were talking about, right? Like, it's very exciting in a certain sphere of people, but then you can tell other people, oh, I had a paper published in so-and-so journal, and they're like, I don't even know what that means.
Yeah. But it's still, I think for the majority of the people, though, whether they know what it is or not, they can acknowledge that as an accomplishment.
Right. I hope so. I put it on my LinkedIn, so
hey, that's huge.
Which I do with almost nothing. So
it's amazing. You know, I remember seeing it pop up on my LinkedIn. I think I liked it.
Yeah. Thank you for liking it.
Of course.
It felt good because there was a period in my life where I thought I was going to be an academic. And if you are an academic, being published that's the biggest thing you want. And it was a nice moment of reflection for me where I said, Kyle from a few years ago would be so excited to know that I was finally published in an academic journal. And I still am very proud. Don't get me wrong. Like, I mean, it was very, very exciting. But it was also a moment where I thought, I'm not really aiming to be an academic anymore. I have this accomplishment that is an accomplishment in this sphere. But I'm now moving on to other things. No, not necessarily better things, but just different things, you know? Does
that do anything for your confidence level?
It makes me feel better when I email my resume to somebody.
Sure. Okay.
It's saying a room of 5 to 10 pretty smart people read what you wrote and were like, all right, I buy it.
Yeah.
You know? Which is good. So yeah.
That's awesome. How did you get into this line of work? Did you go to university with the intention of being like, I'm going to, work for these aid organizations, I'm going after working at the UN, or was it something different?
I mean, depending how far back you want to go. I mean, when I did my bachelor's degree, I had no clue what I wanted to do. I thought I wanted to be a Canadian politician. So I went to McGill to do political science, thinking, I'd go move to Ottawa and work at the House of Commons. And then after my first year, I thought that's not what I want to do. Ended up taking political theory because I thought that was kind of exciting. That's where that's where you're actually debating.
Yeah.
That's where the real debates are going on. Like, what do you actually value over something else? So I was doing philosophy for, like a few years pretty much. And then I started getting into more international politics stuff towards the end of my bachelor's degree. And then I took some time off, and then I went to, because I still didn't really, like, you get out of a bachelor's degree. Some people are like, yeah, I figured out what I want to do. I'm going to, be a dentist now. That didn't happen for me. So I took 2 years off. I went to Guatemala. And yeah, again, I got closer to the issues that I had up to then only read about. And I thought, I'm not really content now with just reading about these things and trying to make eloquent arguments about them in paper form. It's important to actually get a sense of
Experience it.
Yeah. Which pulled me towards doing, I didn't know that it was going to be humanitarian or development or conflict work. I just knew that I wanted to get in roughly in that sphere. So I did a master's degree in global affairs, which is a fantastically broad thing to get a master's degree in global affairs. It's fucking everything that's not on Mars, And then it was through that program that these opportunities came up. I had the opportunity I traveled to Nigeria to do a project there. I traveled to Ecuador to do another project there. And then towards the end of my degree, this opportunity to go to South Sudan with Danish Refugee Council came up. So it was equal parts having a loose idea of the direction I wanted to go in, and then just opportunities coming up and being able to take advantage of them.
Cool. So what was South Sudan like? What were you doing there?
I was working as a consultant for the Danish Refugee Council. I'm trying to think of the best place to start the story because
Well, okay, just let's talk about the Danish Refugee Council. Like, what were you doing there for them? What was the purpose of them being there? Let's give some background on South Sudan and what is happening there to give context of why you were there.
Yeah. So it's obviously a very, very long story, and I'm by no means an authority on South Sudan. I am not South Sudanese, you may have noticed. So I'm certainly not the best person to ask about these things. But very generally, I mean, South Sudan has been in a civil war since 2013 that's basically divided the country in half. It's mainly an ethnic civil war, but it's also a whole bunch of conflicts sort of piled on top of each other. So as in other war zones, there is a modest presence of humanitarian organizations there. And Danish Refugee Council is one of these humanitarian organizations. Some of those organizations focus on provision of food. So there's like the World Food Program that most people have probably heard of. Some are providing water. Danish Refugee Council does a bunch of different, has a bunch of different programming. They do a lot of protection, so gender-based violence programs. They have a division that does demining work, so actually blowing up unexploded mines that are just lying around. So Sudan used to be one country, just called Sudan, and then the north of the country had, sort of got all the power after colonialism, used that power to oppress the south of the country, which created several civil wars within Sudan over decades. Eventually, the civil war ended with a peace agreement in the 2000s. And part of that peace agreement was the South Sudanese voting on independence. And something like 99% of South Sudanese voted in favor of becoming an independent country. So it's actually the newest country on earth.
Wow.
When you drive through Juba, the capital, there's actually a billboard that says, "Welcome to the world's newest country," which is pretty interesting.
That's not something you see ever.
No, exactly. There was 2 years where they were very excited about their independence and people were very, very optimistic about South Sudan. And then a bunch of existing tensions in the country kind of came to the surface again once they had independence. And like I said, these are sort of ethnic divisions. And then the country re-erupted into civil war in 2013. And it's been in a state of civil war since then, to varying degrees of intensity. I was there because one of the programs that this organization wants to start implementing in South Sudan is peace building programming. So the idea is that once the conflict is over, many of these humanitarian organizations are going to leave because the needs aren't urgent and pressing anymore. How do you ensure that the country doesn't just completely fall apart again once the war is over and the organizations leave? Obviously, the tensions that created a war don't just go away once you say, oh, we've signed a peace agreement. Mm-hmm. Great. So broadly speaking, what I was there doing was seeing if there was the possibility, judging by the status of where the country was at when I was there, seeing if there was the possibility for sort of grassroots peace building work. Actually, instead of just signing a formal peace agreement between, the president and the vice president, working at the community level, seeing, well, can you two communities, you've had a lot of conflict and tensions in the past. Is there a future where you're working together on, farming or small businesses, or is there a way that you can exist next to each other in the future following this horrific conflict?
And was it what you expected?
Yes and no. Going into a conflict zone, there's a lot of reason to feel freaked out. People who haven't been to environments like that, there's a tendency for people that haven't traveled to developing countries just to be freaked out, period. Sure. As soon as you say, well, I'm traveling to an African country, some people are just like, aren't you nervous? And you're like, no. But South Sudan's like another level because it is at such a stage of violence. Mm-hmm. So I was a little nervous that I would get there and it would be really, you have these fears it's going to be, bullets flying and you ducking in cover and that sort of thing. And it wasn't like that. There are huge parts of the country that are still functioning. War, like life goes on even during the war, sure. Right? Yeah. So even though there's a war raging in certain parts of the country, the airport still works. There's the groceries. People are still shopping in grocery stores. People are still out and living their lives. And generally, that's what I saw. I saw a country that was doing their very best to live their lives still, despite the fact that there was so much chaos sure. going on in the areas around them. So was it what I expected? It was honestly not as fear-inducing as I thought it would be. Once the initial disorientation wears off, it was a bunch of really welcoming, genuine, absolutely phenomenal people that I met when I was there. Like people in South Sudan are just incredible, incredible people. It's a shame that they're sort of written off as being this war-torn, chaotic country, right? Because once you scratch the surface a little bit more and get below the news story, it's actually a very, very beautiful country with a really fascinating story.
I can relate to that in a way that anytime that I've gone down to Central America has lots of bad things associated with it, gangs, all kinds of things. And there are those pockets of things. And I remember the first few times I went down there to either Honduras or Nicaragua. Yeah, sorry.
Anaconda.
Yeah. I had concerns. Probably much different than what you had because South Sudan, like you said, does kind of have a larger, a deeper rooted issue that more people are familiar with when it comes to violence. But I did find that when I got down there, I loved the people. The people were all so amazing. and really made you feel at home. And like, this is just their lives, and they're just going about their lives. They're very welcoming to include you in their lives. I saw little to no violence whatsoever, and it completely changed things for me, because that was my first experience with a developing country scenario, and it totally changed what I had thought it would be.
Yeah, I'm right. I mean, it's not to, I'm in no way am I trying to downplay the violence and death that is occurring in these places, in Central America as well as South Sudan. But it's such a disservice to them to just write them off as conflict prone or crime ridden or anything like that. When you go, you should take precautions, obviously, right? I mean, you're an idiot if you parachute into South Sudan and think that you can just walk around freely. No. If you go with one of these organizations, they take a tremendous amount of care to make sure you're going in the places that have been established they're okay to go. There's a curfew that you pretty strictly have to adhere to. So it's not just like, oh, I can go to any country no matter how dangerous and I'll be fine. Like, that's not what I'm trying to say. But right, there's a very rich story in these places if you just get past the sort of knee-jerk tendency to write them off.
It is not what Donald Trump would lead you to believe these places
that
are.
Fucking moron.
Yeah, we don't even need to get
that. No, I mean, it is interesting because, for example, I mean, talk about the how hospitable people in these countries can be. Trump fucking gets all bent out of shape, because there are, I mean, whatever. We don't have to wade into this issue because
we could talk about it forever.
It's complicated, but I mean, very briefly, he makes such a mountain out of a molehill, right? He treats this issue in the U.S. like he's the only person who's bringing in asylum seekers or refugees. But if you actually compare the number of refugees or asylum seekers that are coming into the U.S. versus in places like South Sudan, surrounding countries, Lebanon, Syrian refugees in Lebanon, those countries take in refugees by the millions, right? And where I was, these were people with very little, I mean, very, very impoverished people, subsistence agriculture, often little to no access to clean drinking water. And they would say, we want to accept these people into our community because we understand what they're going through. And it really resonated with me. I thought, someone who really has, comparatively has very, very little, doesn't have a lot to live with, they can still find it in them to say, yeah, I will welcome these people and protect them from the violence that they're fleeing. But, a millionaire with a toupee, can't pull himself together to do the same thing. It does really open your eyes to, like, I knew Trump was a jackass, but now I just think that even more.
Yeah, and more people know it too.
I hope more people know it.
Well, some people choose to ignore the obvious, but
yeah,
because he's the religious candidate.
Yeah, let's talk about religion next.
Nah.
Yeah. He'll come up again, I'm sure.
Oh, of course. How could he not? So having been through or seeing this place and having it change what you thought it may be, like what do you bring back to Canada now? What have you absorbed? What have you learned from it? How has it changed who you are? How will you take it to your next experience, your next job that's kind of a similar nature?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Okay, so another example for me. So when I was down in Mexico, on the border of Mexico and Guatemala, and I saw all these migrants coming across the river, and then I shot an interview with this poor girl that had been abducted into gangs down in Honduras and was a sex slave for years. She had AIDS. She had finally was able to escape and make it out, and she's now living in Mexico. On some sort of like a safe compound where they are just helping all of these people. And I got to sit there in this room and shoot this interview with her. And this room was nothing special. I think she shared a room with like 5 or 6 other people. You know, it wasn't the cleanest thing, but and she has this disease now. She had terrible, terrible things happen to her. And at the time, it seemed like she was happier than I was. Mm-hmm. And I remember I shot a bunch of different interviews where this, you know, very similar stories. Some people had to, you know, there was this one guy that got kidnapped and taken onto the top of this mountain, and this group of people pulled a bag off of his best friend's head and said, kill him. Mm-hmm. Told this kid to kill him. And I remember, you know, after these interviews, I'd climb back into our van and just like almost break down crying, just being like, I feel like I knew that this stuff was happening a little bit, but like now it is so much more real. Mm-hmm. And it made me feel like I just didn't appreciate this stuff enough.
Well, it's very different. I mean, you can read the news a lot, mm-hmm. And you can read about, there's a conflict in South Sudan, and then there's the rebel stronghold in Syria was bombed, and there's so much you can read and try and understand on an intellectual level. And, you know, you can read the statistics and go, I understand that there's poverty and there's hunger and whatever. But it is very different to step out of the plane, you know, smell the air around you and walk around and actually kind of get a feel for what life like that is like, you know, life in an impoverished country or where there's a conflict or something like that. And you're right. I mean, some of what you take from that is, wow, I need to sort of check myself, because the things that stress me out on a day-to-day basis in Canada, in the grand scheme of things, I probably don't really need to stress out about mm-hmm. that much, right? But on the other hand, it's also nice to go to those places and say, you know, despite this despair and this poverty and these challenges, there's still a lot of joy in these lives, you know? Mm-hmm. So you get sort of both sides, right? It's the devastation of these things hits you a lot harder, but also the ability for life to persevere through it also kind of gets to you.
Sure.
Which is, I think, a good learning experience to have. I mean, it was hard, right? Coming. So I remember, for example, the fourth day I was doing this assignment in South Sudan, and they said, we're going to take you for a car tour of the refugee camps, just to get a sense of what's going on around, and so that you can sort of just get a sense of the area. And driving through a refugee camp is a very, very moving, very intense experience. I had read a lot about refugees, right? I'd written papers about refugees, but I'd never driven through a refugee camp. And that really just gives you a new perspective on it, right? I mean, entire like groups of children just playing in the mud, you know? And you think to yourself, like, I see kids that age in Canada playing on a playground, and here they are with no food, little water, playing in the mud. You know, that really hits you. And it makes it hard to come back to Canada and have somebody complain to you that, you know, they had to wait in line for their coffee for too long. You know, you're like, really? Like, that's the thing you're going to complain about? But then on the other hand, I totally acknowledge that nobody likes that asshole who's like, yeah, well, there are kids starving in Africa, you know, first world problems.
Right.
And you know, no one wants to be that either. I think it's obvious that, like, you know, the things that I was in the grocery store 2 days ago and was pissed off that they didn't have kimchi, you know? And I caught myself being like, yeah, I mean, this is the problems I encounter day to day, and that's fine.
But that's kind of what it's about, though. It's not about being the asshole that says, well, there's starving kids in Africa. It's about how you apply it to your life.
Yeah.
And the fact that you were able to recognize that, like, you know what? They don't have kimchi, but there are worse things.
Yeah.
I think that's maybe more beneficial than being the dickhead that's more often than not the dickhead that says, well, the starving children in Africa have never been to Africa.
Yeah, exactly. Or you like, yeah, exactly that. Or people, you know, there are people who travel. I'm nervous about that because I totally understand what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, there's also people that are like, wow, I went to Dominican Republic and it changed me, and now I'm this like, I'm totally get this the whole world and then blah blah blah, and you're like, you know, get over yourself. Like, no, you don't. You know?
Yeah, totally.
Right?
It just,
If that makes sense.
Oh, 100%. It just becomes a little bit more real. It's not something you read in the newspaper, you see on the news.
Yeah.
It's seeing it firsthand is a little bit different than seeing it.
It is.
Yeah.
So I came back and said, you know, when I do this type of work now, I have something to connect it to. Mm-hmm. I've sat across from a refugee and heard their story, you know, or I've walked through the sort of muddy paths of, you know, the refugee camp, and I have like a like tangible feeling connected to it, but I didn't come back saying I am now one with South Sudan. You know,
No.
like that's just being a white savior, and you shouldn't do that.
That's hilarious. So another feather in the cap is you just landed a gig in New York City for the UN, correct? Mm-hmm. Which is the dream.
We'll see, won't we?
Yeah. I've heard mixed reviews.
The UN is often the dream because it's the biggest organization doing this sort of work. Everyone's heard of it. Mm-hmm. Well, mostly everyone's heard of it.
It'd be one of those situations where you didn't have to explain to anybody.
Sort of,
you would
right?
literally drop, I work for the UN. Cool.
Well, yeah, when you say I'm working for this NGO, they're like, what does that stand for? Mm-hmm. And like, I'm working for this firm, and they're like, I've never heard of it. Usually people have heard of the UN, so it does save you some explaining. Mm-hmm. Saves me some explaining, which is nice. Is it the dream? I don't know, because if you do field work, if you're the person that travels to South Sudan or the Congo, or even not conflict zones, right? Just if you're in the business of traveling to foreign countries to do your work, you get very close to what's happening, and you do feel this connection that we were talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. It's not always the case that that's how you feel when you work for an organization like the UN. There are many people that work for the UN who live in Geneva and and work a 9-to-5 office job and are very far away from the projects that are happening in the many countries, various different countries. So I think there are trade-offs. I'm going to really enjoy living in New York.
Yeah, that's pretty cool.
I am excited to eat pastrami sandwiches. So I used to live in Montreal, and there's this kind of like big New York rivalry because Montreal has smoked meat, New York has pastrami, Montreal has Montreal bagels, New York has New York bagels. You know, I'm interested to see where my allegiances lie after I've spent some time in New York. Maybe the New York bagel will be my new favorite bagel.
I'm going to step in here quickly just because I just had a New York bagel, and Steve and I had we had a pretty good talk about the New York versus Montreal bagel, and I think our alliances or allegiances lay with the Montreal.
Montreal.
Yeah.
I imagine that my allegiances will stay there. Mm-hmm. But I'm excited to.
It's not that it was a bad bagel. You got to kind of dig deep on this one.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Yeah, fair enough. So suffice to say, I'm going to enjoy living in New York and getting to discover New York. But I'm honestly not sure if I'm going to enjoy working at the New York headquarters in an office more than I'm going to enjoy working in a place like South Sudan. Mm-hmm. New York is certainly safer. The job is more secure and stable. But I will be sort of far away from the work that's happening on the ground and in the field. So we'll see if it's a dream, but yes, it's easier to explain to people.
Yes. And nonetheless, it's an exciting opportunity.
It's a super exciting opportunity. And I'm very, very grateful that it's a very, very difficult organization to get into. I was joking to you the other day. I mean, the UN knows that a lot of people want to work for it. So it sort of plays hard to get. It doesn't just give you a job. It says, well, I mean, if you want to be an intern at the UN, they don't pay you. So many people end up working for the UN for no money for many months. Even after that, if you start getting paid, it's still it's not always an easy lifestyle to make happen. Sometimes the people that become freelancers are the people who are meant to be freelancers, but sometimes it's just the people that had the luxury of their life situation being such that they could swing being a freelancer.
Sure.
I think the UN is very much the same way. It'd be easy for someone to say, oh, I mean, I'm at the UN because it's what I've always wanted to do, and that just jives with the type of person I am. But also, many people who work at the UN, it's like, well, you're also there because you could afford to not be paid for 6 months.
Right.
Perhaps you can just make living in Geneva or New York work, which are just some of the most outrageously expensive cities on planet Earth. And it is too bad because, exactly that. I mean, I think what would make these organizations, rich and informed would be being able to have a diversity of people working there. Often that does happen. I'm not trying to smear the UN at all,
No.
but it is an obstacle that gets in the way. That often it's, sometimes the very people you want working there are the exact people that can't manage to make life line up in the way that would make it suitable for them to work there.
But realistically, I think that is like that for a lot of companies, organizations, whatever it may be. There are tons of I can relate to that. There are lots of in filmmaking. It's a long game. So there are lots of people that just had the luxury of being able to wait longer than anybody else, and they were the only ones left, and then they get the jobs.
Yep.
That's not everybody. There are lots of talented people that get it right from the moment they decide that they want to be a filmmaker. So,
yeah, no, I think that's good to remember though, because when you grow up in North America, there's definitely a prevalent narrative that's like, if you just work hard enough, you'll get it.
It's the American dream.
Yeah. And that's a good thing to think. And I think for many people, it is true. But at the same time, I've met so many bands who were the best performing, most talented people I've ever met, who worked harder than anyone else I've ever seen, and it just didn't pan out for them. I'm sure you've met some very talented filmmakers who just couldn't, it just didn't connect. So hard work, yes, but it also circumstance, right?
Circumstance is a huge thing.
Yeah.
Right time, right moment. Have you read the book Outliers?
Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah.
No. Should I?
You should. Well, I mean, if you're interested.
Oh, it's this hockey players are usually born between January and April.
Yeah.
Steve Jobs had access to a computer when he grew up.
It goes into these things, yeah. So it kind of like debunks some of that, but also it's I am due to reread it, but like if you are interested in a little bit more of like what we were just talking about and kind of digging into it a little bit more, it's a very good book. Yeah. It is interesting to read.
I think it's good to be critical of that very ultra capitalist, Kevin O'Leary.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Oh, you just work hard and everything's going to pan out.
No.
No. Read either.
Well, here's an interesting question that I haven't asked anybody else. But
excellent.
Yeah. Who would you like to see on this podcast? Who do you think would benefit from coming on this podcast? For
Donald Trump.
I refuse.
Yeah. No, good.
That would be too much fun.
Like people we know or like celebrities?
I'd say like accessible people.
Accessible people.
People that like have, maybe a similar story to yourself or, myself, or just, something that you're interested in. I'm just trying to diversify because like I've had a lot of creatives on it. I've had yourself. I've had a few entrepreneurs on it, that kind of thing. Just anybody that has like an interesting story, something that people would enjoy hearing about, would value and learn from. Well,
it's interesting because you and I were talking about why you named this podcast what you named it. And I thought that was cool because it's not always the people that live interesting lives that are interesting. it's how people relate to what they've experienced and how they choose to share it with you and how they've engaged with their own experiences that make it interesting.
Exactly.
You know, you could get someone on this podcast that's worked at the A&W down the street, and they could be straight up like 10 times more interesting than me if the way that they relate to what they've experienced is different. So I think that's cool. I like that.
It is quite it's open-ended to anybody really that just has experiences that have influenced who they are or made them what they are.
I used to listen to this podcast called, that I also really liked, called The Partially Examined Life. If you've ever had to read Plato, when you do like a first year political science program, they always huck Plato at you. And you're like, here, you got to read Plato. And Plato very famously said, was it Plato? Pretty sure it was Plato. Might have been Socrates, but quoted by Plato, who said the unexamined life isn't worth living. You know, if you're just going to coast through life, then why are you going to do that? And so this podcast is called The Partially Examined Life, because they're like, well, we don't want to be like Plato, who just dissects everything, you know, within an inch of its life. And it's like exhausting to listen to. But you also want people that aren't just coasting through, you know, they're like, oh, I'm actually occasionally reflecting on and thinking about the shit that I'm doing. I mean, I think about something like photography, and sometimes I think, you know, anyone can take a sunset and take a good picture of a sunset, you know. Yeah. It takes a skilled photographer to take a really nice picture of like a dirty alley in Mexico City, you know, with like garbage strewn, and to make that something where you go, wow, that's a really powerful image. I think of it the same way. You know, anyone can say, oh, well, I've been to 150 countries and I speak 10 languages and I know how to make Manhattan, you know, and to sound like some interesting person. But many of the people that are like surface level interesting, you know, then you talk to them and you're like, oh, you actually aren't. You're not really that interesting.
No.
You sound cool from far away.
No.
But you're, you know, I sound like a jerk. But then, you know, people who you might not think have very interesting stories to tell, you start talking and you go, wow, you know, you know, the experience you had driving to Oakville, which is not a thrilling experience for anyone that's done it. But maybe there's like some really interesting insights that came from that experience, you know, that make you look at an experience and a person differently.
That changed your life.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Or didn't change your life, you know, or were you like, I also think that's like an interesting angle of this, right? Last time we were talking about, Eat, Pray, Love.
Right.
I was beefing Eat, Pray, Love because there's this whole Eat, Pray, Love trope, you know, white person from the United States goes to, pick your country, India or, you know, wherever, and they come back and they're like, oh, I'm enlightened and I'm blah, blah, blah. You know, like maybe something doesn't change you down to the bone and suddenly enlighten you to the universe.
Maybe it was just a trip.
Maybe it just makes you go, I look at that differently now. Yeah. But that's interesting enough. You know, you don't need this like life-changing, oh my God, you know, I found enlightenment or whatever.
But yeah, I agree with you. And on that note, let's get out of here. Kyle, I really do appreciate you giving me some time to come on here, talk about your life, everything that you've been up to. Congratulations on all your success. I am looking forward to coming down and visiting you in New York City in the summer.
That sounds great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for checking out the Road Traveled podcast. I hope you enjoyed the show. You can find more episodes with other great guests at jessedhunt.com/podcast or on iTunes, Spotify, SoundCloud, and YouTube. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. We'll see you next time.